Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Vlad, and I am here with O.W.L, Behind the Lines, a topical writing wrap-up. And this is season number 1, and our debut, episode number 1. And today, I'm just going to jump right into it. Today, what I am doing, is I am going to go through my most recent verse. And I am going to do a breakdown of this verse. I wrote out a bunch, actually. It's pretty in depth. I'm going to try to make it get through it as quick as possible. So let's get right started. The topic will be there'll either be a link to the topic or it'll be the thumbnail. It's basically just an open field with a bunch of keys coming out of the ground, tall, like 20-foot keys, and there's an old man sort of walking through this field. So, here we go. Bright white lights, curtains closed for comfort. Tonight's the night, it's certainly the number. November 11th, as fitting as snug blankets, remembrance of blessings, splitting the smug banquet. This was the last time he opened his eyes. Come closer, please hear me. Oh, how it's all flashed by, broken in cries. I took hold of his hand dearly. Do tell, Stanley. You know how much I love your stories. Even when they're boring, his humor roared to the last moment. Though his look began changing in an instant, serious contemplation, mysterious, locked in patience, emotion ranging with insistence, voice drained and gaining distance, I knelt close. Please go on, I'm listening. The sweat on his forehead glistened, his words meeting with resistance. I'll start at the beginning. William was ambitious. We knew he was corporal quality. First to arrive, last to leave. To us his regimen was a horrible oddity. At first we poked and prodded, never gaining any traction. Till the day he saved our lives, it's been ingrained inside my actions. He paused for a sip of water. We became pinned in a church tower, surrounded beyond belief. Beams were crashing down around us, pounding down upon the streets. The enemy entering the stairway, we had minutes, maybe seconds. He smiled before he left us. You know, I always enjoyed your jokes. And with those words he broke. Through the hall he began sprinting, yelled, Go now and take the window. That's when we heard the click of a pin. The explosion that followed is something, I can still feel it within, knowing he sacrificed himself so that we could make it back to our kin. Oh, Stanley, I'm so sorry, dear. Charles was a joker. Christ, he'd make knees go weak with laughter. He pulled the biggest pranks, never minding what happened after. Took his punishment in stride. He'd say, a smile is all that matters. Washing dishes, cleaning crappers. To him, the fun came with the pride. On a typical Tuesday, we'd been tasked with tending to patrol. We started taking fire. From where? I'll never know. I was struck in the shoulder, swung violently to the ground. Gunfire kept erupting. Somehow I was protected, but I'll never forget the sound. When our team eliminated the enemy, I crawled backwards, looking down. Charles had given up his body for me, and in his blood I was now drowned. Stanley, I don't know what to say. These men, I called them brothers, loved them all as so. They were the keys to my survival, and I've continued to let them know. Every Sunday evening I took flowers to their graves. Without them I'd be dead. My road is one they've paved. Please keep up the trend, memorialize their flawless deeds in bliss. And with that, his last words, I love you. Then he made me promise to honor this wish. There's the verse. And I was actually super happy with how it turned out. Yeah, I didn't expect that it would go as far as it did. It was sort of a last minute thing, but super excited about it. Like it a lot. And so now what I was going to do is I was going to go into a little breakdown, sort of the depth behind it. So we have bright white lights, curtains closed for comfort. Tonight's the night, it's certainly the number. November 11th is fitting as snug blankets, remembrance of blessings, splitting the smug banquet. So the first line of this immediately sets the scene of the room. The bright white lights could be referring to a hospital, really anywhere that wants to focus on a person or object. The curtains closed for comfort. I thought it was a nice addition, gives a sense of intimacy or privacy. Also, I see it limiting the scene to the room, the exact moment and place that we're in. The second line is a bit of a setup line, not overly mentionable otherwise in its own right, though when we do go back to the rhythmic pattern that's being used, the line is a full follow-through of the scheme that started in the first, which was bright white lights, tonight's the night. The two adds an additional syllable, but the feel of the rhyme, while simple, I thought was mentionable. The second being curtains closed for comfort, certainly the number, which is the same thing. It's a bit more pronounced in the scheme of the first two rhymes, being that it is the end rhyme. The wording in the scheme is slightly more complex than the other one, so it does stand out a little bit further. November 11th, as fitting as snug blankets. That's the next line. Again, the comfort, the intimacy, privacy being portrayed allows the reader to envision the scene that's being written about while being metaphoric. November 11th, referring to that date being fitting, also being Remembrance Day, which I believe is the first hint at the subject matter, sort of the plot or setting. Remembrance of blessings, splitting the smug banquet, which is another touch on Remembrance Day, and a reflective touch as well from the main character. Splitting the smug banquet, an interesting choice of wording. It was slightly to go to fit with the scheme that was used. The imagery of that section alone, the vision that I got was a dinner party, perhaps populated by sort of rich and important guests. In this sense, it would be sort of a metaphor for an interruption of thought. It's the smug banquet. Also, so on the technical side, the rhyme scheme and the switches, much like the first two lines. November 11th, remembrance of blessings. It's not as complete as the previous ones, a bit more slanted towards the end in how it sounds. In terms of the wording, it is quite a bit more complex in itself as a rhyme scheme. And to finish out the section, as fitting as snug blankets, splitting the smug banquet, which is a bit tighter. The end rhyme, again, will be more pronounced, focused upon, which is why the previous one, the November 11th, Remembrance of Blessings, was able to be a bit more slanted. It didn't take the focus away, and it took a backseat to the end rhyme. Overall, this section, coupled with the introduction, setting a scene with the intricacies of the well-developed rhyme scheme, the wording was tight and smooth and allowed for a decent pace to start the piece off. Moving on, line by line, actually. This was the last time he opened his eyes. Come closer, please hear me. The way that's broken down, specifically with the commas, was done on purpose, obviously. Creates a sense of slowing down the pace a little bit, illustrating an important moment which either defines or will set up an event that will occur in the future of the piece. The dialogue, come closer, please hear me, is short, simple. The scene is easy to see, especially with the imagery pulled from the last section. You can get the sense this is a man opening his eyes for the last time, his last night, in a room with the bright white lights, curtains closed. The metaphor as fitting as snug blankets can apply as well. Seeing the man perhaps in a bed, wrapped tightly for warmth. The dialogue was meant to be sort of a whisper. A man on his deathbed, again, opening his eyes for the last time. He'd be weak, perhaps timid. Dialogue itself, come closer, please hear me. He recognizes this weakness. He knows what stage he's at, and he wants to make sure he's heard. Next line, oh, how it's all flashed by. Broken in cries, I took hold of his hand dearly. Begins with the slight reflective state, a short reminiscence of the journey to this point. A bit of emotion makes itself known to the story, and is again easy to visualize. Someone that's been with this man for at least quite a time, choked up, crying, moving closer to him to hear him, taking hold of his hand. In terms of the technical standpoint of the writing, it follows a similar pattern to the first section. That would be, this was the last time, how it's all flashed by. Opened his eyes, broken in cries. Come closer, please hear me. Took hold of his hand dearly, which is 3 separate schemes in that section, matching between lines in order, broken slightly by the commas to, again, accentuate the scene, not taking away anything from the content and the part of the story that's being told. The pace, however, even with the commas, is smooth due to the continuous cycle of rhyming, and allows the reader to go through the section the way it was meant to be written. Next line, do tell Stanley, you know how much I love your stories. And we're finally getting a name, putting a name to the man that's in the story, the man opening his eyes for the last time. We're giving a feeling as well of the other character. The you know how much I love your stories, the dialogue, indicative that these two have known each other for quite a while, perhaps husband and wife, close friends, life partners, along those sort of lines. The line, I believe, is massive because it's a touch of humanity. The feeling of it is real, and this, after the scene setting and emotion from broken in cries, I took hold of his hand dearly. I believe that adds tremendously to the overall story so far. The next line, even when they're boring, his humor roared till the last torrent. And the line carries the rhyme from how much I love your stories to even when they're boring, which adds a speedy and flawless transition between the lines. This line also adds another touch of humanity and gives a ton of character to the man. The slight emotion change is like the first sharp turn of a roller coaster, in that it immediately switches the vibe of the piece. Gives a sense of quiet lightness to that part. The use of humor roared might seem slightly out of place, given that we know this man is weak, opening his eyes for the last time, but it's also used to be a comparison between the weakness and a positive quality from his life. This doesn't necessarily imply that he's roaring now, but probably more so that his humor and laughter was loud and contagious in life. This section capitalizes well on the scene that was set, and it provides a wealth of character development to both characters in the story. The technical writing and scheme used, again, provided a very steady pace and enhanced the content and this part of the story. Next section, the line, though his look began changing in an instant, serious contemplation, which is another dramatic shift in momentum. And feeling to begin this section. Another sharp turn of that roller coaster of emotion. Next line, mysterious, locked in patience, emotion ranging with insistence. Accentuating the feel of the stanza and story as it's progressing. This adds a bit of mystery to the piece, and taking from previous progressions, specifically Come Closer, Please Hear Me, the dramatics of what the man is going to say or tell is sort of a cliffhanger in its own right. Emotion ranging with insistence. This another piece of writing that isn't something that really seems common, but the way it's done gives further emphasis on the man's look, the man's words, and the almost necessity of the reader needing to know what he's going to say. The scheme work with these two lines was a bit unorthodox, without a clear matching end rhyme, if we're looking at the two lines together or individually. However, it does follow an ABBA pattern, which was changing in an instant, ranging with insistence, and also serious contemplation, mysterious locked-in patience. This was a choice to switch the style up slightly, to add a bit of depth to the scheme work, the technicality, as well as a slight edge of showing off, saying there's no limits, can do what I want. Next line, voice drained and gaining distance. I knelt close. Please go on. I'm listening. Which is more description of the events happening. The second character getting closer to hear the man due to his weak voice beginning to falter. The recognition of that and the dialogue is a form of permission, not only between the characters, but also to the story itself, to begin to take shape in the meat and the flesh of the story. Sort of the turning point as we're climbing. Next line, the sweat on his forehead glistened, his words meeting with resistance, which is, again, more descriptive of the main character, the man, Stanley, his energy waning as he attempts to speak again, which leads into the end of the first section of the piece, where the dialogue, he says, "I'll start at the beginning," which, coupled as the rising action, is a huge cliffhanger right before the break. It's sort of similar and has the sense of the end of a thriller mystery novel, a chapter in which the reader is left wondering what's about to happen, what's about to be told, and it gives the reader the need and want to read to continue to find out. It's all about the transitions there as well. The rhyme scheme that started with changing in an instant became the centerpiece of the rhythmic basis to this section. There was a slight switch to open the stanza, then the continuation of the A scheme throughout the rest. That lack of switch allows the pace to be quickened, not having to pick up on a brand new syntax. It hurries the piece to the break with a sense of almost urgency, which, coupled with the cliffhanger, gives the feeling of suspense. We start the next section. William was ambitious. We knew he was corporal quality. So we pick the story back up, and it's now being told first person from the perspective of Stanley. Also, we know from I'll start at the beginning that this is a recollection of events seen or experienced by him. We have a new character being introduced, William, and immediately there's a lot being told about this character. It answers any possible questions that usually come up in writing, sort of this one being, what is the main thing noticed about this character in going into his personality? We signifying that the man and William are part of some sort of group, since the we isn't referring to just the man and William because of the grammatical and the English used there. Sort of the sense, the perspective of that. Corporal quality gives the insight that this is part of an army or war. Ambitious and corporal quality giving hints into either like a ranking or promotion, or even at the simplest, again, a characterization of the new character. The next line, first to arrive, last to leave, to us his regimen was a horrible oddity. That's more character building, and the standout comparison describing William's ambition and motivation. The rhyme scheme has switched to end rhymes only so far in this section, which allows a steady pace, not broken up by any switches. It signifies the desire for the reader to be able to read continuously and progress. That said, the rhyme scheme used, corporal quality, horrible oddity, is quite unique and complex in itself, that there is still that amount of technicality. The next line we have, at first we poked and prodded, never gaining any reaction. And that's a bit different characterization in that it's telling maybe a bit more about Stanley and his group or unit rather than the new character William, but at the same time it goes again to show the ambition and seriousness of William. This sheds light on the entire surrounding cast, not just a single character. The next line, till the day he saved our lives, it's been ingrained inside my actions, which is another small cliffhanger. The piece reading again as if stanzas are chapters in a book, willing the reader to continue, giving the desire to do so. Again, with just the end rhyme, and we can see and tell that the focus is a bit more centered on the story at this point and the characters, rather than the poetic feel or rhythm-based piece. Though it does still provide the smoothness that's been seen and heard throughout. The pace, again, is ever important in a story-based piece like this. You need those sort of rises and falls, and it needs to be continuous without breaks as well if you're trying to give the sense of urgency. Next line, a bit of a break. He paused for a sip of water. So it shifts back to the different perspective. The other person in the room. It sort of furthers the cliffhanger. We haven't got to know what's happened yet, so it's still hanging there. It's preparing the reader for something important to be described and to occur. This whole section was really focused on building the additional character, as well as furthering the development of the main character and those around him, while setting the scene immensely for something that's about to happen. Next section, we begin with the line, we became pinned in a church tower, surrounded beyond belief. And that starts right in the action. Brief mention of the environment and a sense of worry, urgency, and or desperation from being surrounded. Next line, beams were crashing around us, pounding down to the streets. Further descriptive of the environment. Crashing around us places the characters in the midst of all of this. The pace has quickened to provide extra dramatics and suspense to the action scene. Next line, the enemy entering the stairway. We had minutes, maybe seconds. More emotion, this time in the form of desperation, also highlighting the events, progressing the story, the events that are happening around and with the characters. Next line, he smiled before he left us. You know, I always enjoyed your jokes. So we're kind of at the point, William, where's William going? What's going to happen? Again, rising action. Telling of the events here, further characterization of William, and a huge human element with the dialogue, you know, I always enjoyed your jokes. Tells a ton about William to further the amount of emotion resting upon his character. The next line, and with those words he broke, through the hall he began sprinting. And this is descriptive telling of the events occurring. The use of he broke and he began sprinting causes the reader to speed up with those wordings in the story, and again, furthering the emotion, desperation, and suspense. Also note, there was a slight switch up again in the schemes. Always enjoyed your jokes, and with those words, he broke. Again, that's the transition. That's the transition rhyme, carries one line into the next. It keeps the scheme work fresh, and again, just helps the transition and the pace. Next line, it yelled, go now and take the window. That's when we heard the click of a pin. Events in action. Then a pause and more suspense with that's when we heard the click of a pin. Leads the reader into an assumption, as if they already know what's going to happen. Makes it a little bit personal there. Provides them the chance to form a thought regarding that, likely along the lines of, oh no, what is about to happen? The transition scheme is shown again here. He began sprinting, take the window. It's slightly slanted again, almost non-noticeable, but it is written that way so that it doesn't overpower the coming end rhyme or the story. The next line being, the explosion that followed is something I can still feel it within. And here's where that suspense and emotion comes to a massive heading with the climax here. The emotion of loss of a character, the emotion from Stanley's perspective, losing a brother in arms, are both prevalent and provide a huge moment of the story. And the next line being, knowing he sacrificed himself so that we can make it back to our kin. This focuses on Stanley's emotion, provided since he is the main character of the overall story, and this is the way of bringing it back to him. As mentioned, there were the few transition scheme switches, otherwise straight end rhymes, both factors coupling to provide the rolling momentum to this tragedy. The next line before the break, oh Stanley, I'm so sorry, dear, which is a perfect time break in the story. It allows the reader a moment to dwell on what's occurred and sort of regather their thoughts. It also provides further insight into the second character who's with and listening to Stanley throughout the story. The section itself here was lined with character descriptive and action. A new character was introduced. Then the reader was allowed to get insight into who he was, what he was about, finally what his role was in the story. The juggling emotions in the section with losing William after just getting to know him is almost cruel, but it does provide a huge basis to the overall story and the main character Stanley and what he's telling. We start the next section. Charles was a joker. Christ, he'd make knees go weak with laughter. And so this is interesting. We're bringing in another new character to begin the section, and the same sort of descriptive approach upon introduction. The character himself seems to be the complete opposite of the previous serious, ambitious William in personality, provides an interesting contrast in the story and grand feel of things. Next line, he pulled the biggest pranks, never minding what happened after. And that's the same template, again, as the previous character introduction. It's more descriptive for the character, again, providing insight into a new character. Next line, took his punishment in stride. He'd say, a smile is all that matters. More descriptive, getting a bit more personal with the character Charles, with the touch of added dialogue here. As was with the last section, the scheme is fairly simple and straightforward, providing the same basis of pace to another potential buildup. Next line, washing dishes, cleaning crappers. To him, the fun came with his pride. Descriptive. Again, digging deeper into the character, what he's done, his personality. The scheme switch again. All that matters, cleaning crappers. Perhaps a bit of a step backwards in terms of the wording that's been consistent by putting in the word crappers. Kind of maybe a bit juvenile, but I believe this does provide a bit more humanity and grit to it. A bit of vulgarity as well. Not quite, but, you know. The next line we have, on a typical Tuesday, we'd been tasked with tending to patrol. And so the scene is switching a bit, as was noticed in the previous section with William. The we in this being either just Stanley and William, or the two of them plus others, at least the two. It's unclear in terms of that, but it may not matter, depending on the route of the events and occurrences to come. In terms of technicality, something we really haven't seen yet here in this piece, a bit of alliteration. Typical Tuesday, tasked with tending to patrol, is a good device to add a bit more depth to the technicality of the writing, just trying to keep it fresh. The next line, we started taking fire from where I'll never know. This is one of the ways to begin an action scene, and this commences literally right in the thick of it. The reflective question posed provides a range of emotions, confusion likely being the most prevalent. I was struck in the shoulder, swung violently to the ground. Action. Again, continuing this time with Stanley finding himself in peril. Already setting up the descriptive of events and the scene underway. Leaves some questions about the future to be answered. Simple rhyme scheme, continuing to place emphasis clearly on the events and actions taking place. Next line, gunfire kept erupting. Somehow I was protected, but I'll never forget the sound. This here shows and allows the reader to form the scene and the sounds in their mind. In a way, it poses another and different question, while furthering the one what could have been asked in the previous line, sort of what happens next, how or why is he protected. The slight addition of an inner rhyme here might be unnoticeable to some, but it acts as a way to speed and increase the intensity of the scene. Gunfire kept erupting, somehow I was protected. As seen before, a slant rhyme doesn't take away from the focus of the events or the end rhyme scheme. Next line, when our team eliminated the enemy, I crawled backwards looking down. This has both telling and showing in this line and part of the event. The first part being the tell. Very direct way of approaching the end of the gunfight. Really simple in basis. Then it's easy to envision the scene of Stanley crawling backwards. That's the tell. Stanley crawling backwards, eyes on the ground. A slight cliffhanger in itself as we reach the climax of this part of the story. Next line. Charles had given up his body for me, and in his blood I was now drowned. And so here it is. As like before, a big bang of the section and story. Once again, providing a new character. Getting to know him, then taking him away. Cruel again, in a way. But ultimately necessary for the greater good of the story and Stanley, since it's based upon him. Also provides great imagery with in his blood I was now drowned. A bit of a graphic addition there. This is probably a good spot to mention, if noticed. Now, there have been a string and majority of end rhymes throughout these last two stanzas. The end rhymes, while worded simply, are a bit more complex than you'd think upon first look. Within itself, the syllable counts that have been used throughout the piece have been consistent. The example here being violently to the ground, never forget the sound. Crawled backwards looking down, his blood I was now drowned. The set is comprised of 6 syllables, and I believe 5 to 7 count was the prevalent sort of syllable count in the end rhymes if somebody was looking into that. And that is the most consistent part of that helps hugely with the pace and the flow. I hadn't mentioned it yet, because it's just been there. It hasn't been taken away from, it hasn't been added to, it's just been consistent, and for the most part it has taken a backseat to the story being told. But the ability to consistently use more than a 1 or 2 word set as an end rhyme. Again, wonders for the flow, pace, and again the technical writing aspect to this. It's a very good balance. The next line, Stanley, I don't know what to say, which is another small break of the section again. It allows the reader, once again, to deal with the events that have happened, form their own emotions, opinions, maybe angry. That's the first thought. And it allows them to get ready to continue with the end of the story. This begins the falling action of the story, if we'd be looking at a story chart diagram sort of thing. The next line, the last section. These men, I called them brothers, loved them all as so. Major emotional moment here, another moment of human emotion. The realization or assumption that Stanley might be the last one. These men that he had, and we, him and us, as readers, had gotten to know, and they were taken so cruelly and violently, one can't help but feel for this man in his last moments. The other characters as well, especially being that this is a story that he chose to tell with those last moments that he's had left. The next line, they were the keys to my survival. I've continued to let them know. So here's a play on the topic and the picture directly. Also, this is where the title came from. More emotion, the touch of humanity and humility, appreciation and love for the men that were lost and so instrumental in his life. Next line, every Sunday evening I took flowers to their graves. Slightly heart-wrenching. Very human, just raw and natural emotion being displayed as things begin to wrap up. Next line, without them I'd be dead. My road is one they've paved. Again, continuation, flowing in emotion and reflective. The appreciation that Stanley has is extremely easy to be understood and respected. The rhymes here, going back to technicality, love them all as so, continued to let them know. Took flowers to the graves, my road is one they've paved. Again, notice, 5-6 count has continued. Now the word continued, I believe, would need to be sort of more emphasis on the end of that word for it to be able to fit perfectly. So that is one instance where it could have been slightly tightened up. I think that might be the only issue upon rereading that I've come to. The next line we have, please keep up the trend, memorialize their flawless deeds in bliss. That is heartbreakingly genuine, really. And the wording is smooth enough that it allows for full feeling to be felt without distractions. And the last line we have, and with that, his last words were, I love you. Then he made me promise to honor his wish. The first thing to point out, promise to honor, the syntax there helps with that flow. This line is slightly longer. I'll touch on that in a second. This line again, this is raw and real. The I love you to the secondary character, the act of tribute. The whole fact of Stanley being on his literal deathbed, the last thing he chooses to do is tell the story of these heroic men that lost their life for his sake of their own goodness of heart. It's monumental and a beautiful and perfect way to close the story out in terms of that. The last line, technical looking. The last line is slightly longer. Could be seen as a bit stretched in terms of the wording. Promise to honor was a good add. At the same time, it almost prolongs the end of the story, this being slightly longer. Personally, if I'm reading a book, when it comes to an end, that's sort of the saddest part because it's over. There's no more content left. We have to say goodbye to the characters and the story. So with this bit longer line, it does sort of prolong the ending. It gives the reader the fullest closing possible to appreciate before the end. As a whole, I believe that it was an extremely beautiful story that was written. The many emotions caused and gained throughout kept this a roller coaster of a ride. Cliffhangers and foreshadowing brought a great aura of suspense and tragedy in the right places, and the visual descriptive made it easy to place oneself in the middle of the story in the act. That, coupled with the flow and rhyme and the technical prowess of this piece, kept it steady and made for a smooth and almost flawless read. This really, again, has to be one of the pieces that I'm the most proud of writing. The way everything fit together and turned out was way better than I'd imagined when the concept came. In terms of concept, the concept was simple in basis. I took the photo topic, the keys in the open field. I made it a location, which was a memorial graveyard. The keys acting or representing tombs or headstones, also representing the fallen brothers that Stanley had lost along the way. And with his walking through in the picture, it provided the idea for the reflective story, telling and honoring these men with his last breaths. Now, originally I wanted to do 4 sections, each representing a fallen brother. Would have been 4 instead of 2. But when I started writing, from about 8 lines in, I knew that I wouldn't have the space, because I did set a line limit for myself. There wasn't enough time in that story to be able to approach, introduce, and fully flesh out the extra characters. Also, being with the 2 characters, if there were any further added, it might sort of oversaturate the character cast. So that definitely was something that I didn't want to do. The basis was always around the key to survival. The title, again, the brothers being the keys, them providing his survival. I mean, a simple title, maybe overly simple, but that's where it came from. It just seemed obvious. I really was just super stoked about this story from the moment that I finished it. I'm glad I could share this and the breakdown with anyone who's decided to listen. And please don't hesitate to comment, question, or otherwise approach me with any thoughts you may have regarding the story. You might hate me for taking away dear Charles and William. It had to happen. It really did. It had to happen for the greater good. In closing, I'd like to just give a huge amount of thanks to everybody participating, everybody at writingleagues.com. The members are the inspiration and motivation to keep writing, and really just striving to be better each and every time I write. And I hope that you all have enjoyed this, and I hope you stay tuned for further episodes. And again, this is Vlad signing off from O.W.L. Behind the Lines, a topical wrap-up.